Okay, I'm going to skip my intro for now because I know this is going to be a contentious topic, and I beg of you, please hear me out before you pass judgment. Um, because I know that this is probably one of the issues a lot of my audience is most split on, narcissistic abuse, and what I think of the term and stuff like that. And is narcissistic abuse real? Is it an accurate term for what's going on? Isn't it just abuse? And I think there's a lot of layers to this, and I think it's way more nuanced than a lot of people are kind of painting. And I think, honestly, the question of only looking at it through the perspective of is narcissistic abuse real, and using the term narcissistic abuse is stigmatizing, I feel like that misses so much of the real consequences of the pros and cons of using this word. Because let me start out, because I know a lot of my audience are cluster Bs, and like they probably already have kind of an idea of what my problems with it is. So I'm going to start out with why I understand there's some degrees that I think are outweighed of validity to the term itself. I think that the term itself is bad, but let me explain what I mean. Like, I think there is legitimacy in being able to identify certain behaviors in people with certain pathologies that are more prone to abuse. And that's another question. Are people with NPD more prone to abuse? I personally do believe yes. I know there's going to be some people that disagree with that. I know that people with NPD are not more prone to domestic violence, but they are more prone to emotional abuse and degrees of reactive aggression. So take from that what you will. I do have a study backing up the domestic violence ones, by the way. Please somebody remind me to link it because I'm not at my house, so I can't upload this till later. But being able to identify a lot of these behaviors and the motivations behind them, I think can be really helpful for people's healing if they did find themselves in a situation like that. And also, again, not only people are going to do this, but understanding how their brain's functioning and why things happen the way it did obviously can be helpful and can also help you spot more toxic behaviors, right? But that's another part of the issue is that people with NPD aren't the only people with pathologies abusing, and how much of this abuse is limited to people with NPD. They might have different motivations behind the abuse, however, it's still abuse at the end of the day. I feel like the distinction there gets a little bit more muddled. Because like gaslighting, for instance, people with paranoid personality disorder do that all the fucking time. They are scary. The two most abusive people I've ever met in my life had PPD, or at least strong traits of it, and they abused more than anybody I've ever seen with NPD. Personally, that is. Like, I'm sure there's people with NPD out there who have been worse, people without it that have been worse. Because in my relationships, although I've done a lot of shitty things in my life, and I'm even on the more severe side of having a personality disorder, in my relationships, the degree of my emotional abuse, and like it's hard to say whether it was real emotional abuse. I personally, I would kind of see it like this, but it was just me being very criminally distant and making her always question how safe she was that I was going to stay in the relationship. A coldness. And this is one of the most common ways of people with NPD to abuse. I think it's hard to say whether that would be constituted abuse or not, but let me put it this way, it was at least toxic, if not abuse. Even though it was very unknowing of me. And according to like case studies and shit that I've read, that seems to be how most people feel in relationships with people with NPD when it's untreated. It's just like they are not appreciated and like they're kind of cold and distant or whatever. Which I do think, even if it is abuse, is a long stretch away from like irredeemable abuse, if that makes sense. Now, another issue I have with the term is that I don't like the idea of people with, like, let's say there's somebody with NPD, right? And they are an active abuser. I don't like the idea of them being able to hide behind the diagnosis. Even if the diagnosis does make them more prone to abuse. Imagine how somebody who was actively abusive, like let's say they got diagnosed with it and it was like, oh, narcissistic abuse, this makes you more prone to these behaviors. They can easily hide behind that and say, oh, well, I can't help it. And it takes the agency away from the person to change their behavior and onto the diagnosis. If that makes any sense, it's like, oh, well, I don't have to, like, I can't help it. This is just how I am. And that's obviously very toxic. And obviously, like, let's say that, like, you are in a relationship with somebody with NPD who is trying to change but is abusive. You don't owe them to stay in that relationship, right? Abuse is, no matter what, abuse is just not okay. And then obviously the part that gets brought up more is how this affects people who are suffering from NPD. Is it since this association is now put from the person who's being the abuser onto the person's diagnosis, it makes treatment and accepting of the diagnosis a lot harder. And because of that stigmatizing stuff, what if there's somebody with NPD who does need help and is exhibiting abusive behavior and not realizing it, he is far less likely to get help, because he's going to be like, as I say sometimes, when you hear that you just have the asshole disease, you're not going to really want to accept that. And I feel like this takes away from the possibility from a lot of people who are in a cycle of like abusing people from getting legitimate help. Again, I want to point out, not all people with NPD abuse, obviously, but you know, I do think it's important to point that out. And the third point I kind of have is a lot more personal for me, is that, like, I think the term narcissistic abuse really bothers me because one, I want to take responsibility for the things I've done in my life, right? It wasn't my NPD that made me abuse people. It was me who chose to abuse people because I wanted to get an easy way out of getting out of to get my needs met. I didn't want, and I've worked on myself a lot since I've engaged in a lot of these behaviors, and some of them were really awful. Again, I'm not a normal case of NPD. I want to point that out when I tell some of the shitty things I did. I am an extreme case. Most people with NPD are just they kind of come off as like broody kids. You probably assume that they have bipolar first. Or like they're just some guy who has low self-esteem and is always trying to help you out to make him feel better about himself. That's a more normal presentation of NPD. People have been actively abused by people like this, people like me. Not just, there's a lot more going on usually when that happens. But what I was trying to say is that for people like me who have been, again, way more toxic, and at times abusive, there's an implication that because of my NPD, I am, even if I had been abusive in the past, I am cursed to abuse, that I am going to be abusive forever. And just because of how it ties it to the diagnosis, the term narcissistic abuse. And like, I don't know, I think that there's a lot of people out there who like have been abusive and like aren't past redemption. And maybe that's just a selfish thing. I'm not even saying I'm past redemption. I just think there are people that are. And don't get me wrong, everybody should be held accountable for those behaviors. And I'm not saying that if somebody ever abused you, you should ever get back with them, because I do not believe that. I think if somebody abused you, you should be out. But like, if somebody owns up to their shit, what they did, and actively put in the work to change, I don't think that they should be hindered to that or be seen as a lost cause. Now, obviously, the issue is, like, not everybody's going to want to change. But there are some people that do. And again, maybe it's selfish, but I like to think that, like, even people who were shitty in their lives do have redeeming qualities and can eventually get better. Unless you're like a child molester, then fuck you. Like, put them against a wall. Sorry, that was a whole thing. And again, I do think, and I want to leave this off by saying, I do think there are some patterns that you can recognize in people with that have abusive pathological behaviors, and be able to recognize those, and that can help people understand it without actively like tying it to the disorder itself, if that makes sense. It's like, for me, it's like, okay, people who are abused, this is how it should be. It should be, you review the people as abusive, and there's a certain flavor based upon the pathology. For example, my dad, he was abusive in very strange ways because he had Asperger's and OCD. Obviously, I don't want to tie his abuse to those things, but it helped me understand his abuse because I knew the other things that were going on with him. And I think that's a much more healthy way to view it. It's like, okay, somebody who's an NT and abusive, I can look at that and I can kind of know their motivations and understand what the red flags are, understand when I need to draw that line and get out. Somebody with PPD, somebody with BPD, like the same kind of shit. Somebody with autism, I guess. It's like there's going to be certain ways that these behaviors present at first because of the nature of abusers that's going to lead into abuse. And those can be different. I think it's helpful to recognize those things. But we don't have autistic abuse. We don't have OCD abuse. We don't have BPD abuse. And I don't think we should. Because again, this just distracts from the agency of the person and puts it on the diagnosis instead of holding these people accountable truly. My NPD also didn't make me get better, right? My NPD didn't, well, like, it helped sometimes when I used it in that way. But my NPD wasn't like, you're going to get better. I made that decision. I also made the decision to be a shitty person to people. And I don't want that put on my I don't want the fact that I was shitty put on my diagnosis. I don't want the fact that I'm trying to get better put on my diagnosis. I really hope this video makes sense. Because if I'm being honest, like, I don't love the term narcissistic abuse, but I'm not so, like, militant. Like, if I see you use it, I'm not gonna, like, fucking ban you from my channel. I would prefer if you didn't. But, like, I'm not so passionate about it that it really matters. I'm here to educate people, and the opinions that people take away from what I say and how they interpret it, that's up to them. And that's all I can do is share my experiences and my thoughts on this kind of stuff. I mean, I am right, but like, I'm joking, kind of. Anyways, I hope you all have a good day. I really hope this video doesn't get, like, a lot of shit, because I know that, like, a lot of people will not agree with this, but, I feel like everyone's going to get mad at me if I'm being honest. Regardless, I hope you all have a good day. Please like, comment, and subscribe and stuff. Take your fucking meds.